Hey everyone, welcome back to The Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we have a very special guest. I've got John DeRosa here. Thank you so much for coming on. Now, to those of you who don't know, John DeRosa, he's a high school math teacher in New Jersey. He holds a bachelor's degree in math education from the College of New Jersey and a master's degree in mathematics from Montclair State University. And so through involvements in various apologetics groups in his undergraduate years, he basically found a lot of resources and basically found a love in apologetics and philosophy of religion specifically. And that really led him to create classicaltheism.com to help equip others to defend Catholic and classical theistic ideas in conversation. And it's that last bit. I actually really like to highlight that last bit. It's the sort of the human and the dialogue element that is so central to our intellectual and social lives. So I really like how he's focusing on that in conversation thing. I know this conversation between John and me and John is sort of piggybacking off of our conversation, my conversation with Josh Rasmussen, because it's really all about productive dialogue across ideological barriers. And so just to start off as a sort of preliminary question, before we delve into sort of the main topics, can you tell the listeners, just about 60 seconds-ish, what the Classical Theism podcast is all about?
Sure. Yeah. So it's the Classical Theism podcast, and it aims at defending what I call three core pillars of Catholicism. Break it down into one, that God exists, and we focus on the God of classical theism as the name of the podcast. Two, that Jesus is our Messiah and Lord. And three, that he founded the Catholic Church. And as you kind of read, I don't have any special degrees in this stuff. I'm not a philosopher, a theologian, or a historian. So the show is pitched around me inviting on expert philosophers, historians, theologians to give us different ideas, to bounce objections off of them, to hear their arguments for those three pillars.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful, and I would definitely suggest people to go check it out. It's like very top quality, especially with respect to like the philosophical guests that you get on talking about conciliar Trinitarianism and Christology, and especially their relation to classical theism. It's very, very well done. So definitely suggest that for the listeners. But the second thing that I want to ask by way of preliminary is that you, sir, have a proficiency in math. And so I'm wondering, what are some like areas of overlap that you've found like between philosophy and apologetics on the one hand and math on the other that come up in your life? And like, how do you use tools in one area, right, to help you in the other?
That's a great question. I'll just start with this, because I know my degrees say that I have a proficiency in math, but my proficiency is like not as super impressive as it sounds. But that's kind of been one of the fun things about it. So I'll try to be as brief as possible, but I decided in high school that I wanted to be a teacher because I had some really great teachers that influenced me. So it was like I had a really great English teacher, math teacher, and I was like, wow, the way these people have, benefited my life and benefited others, I kind of want to emulate that. But I didn't pick a subject right away. I'm like, oh man, what am I going to pick? I guess I'll pick math. And then I just got thrust into math ed at TCNJ, and we're doing like discrete mathematics, intro to set theory, and I was dying. I didn't know what I was doing. It was like very, very challenging. Here's funny too. I'll add this to the listeners. 2009. So I was in college from 2008 to 2012. 2009, I went into one of my mathematician, one of our professors' office hours. And, he was my linear algebra teacher, and we're just talking about stuff. And he brings up the book he was reading on the beach the past summer. This is in 2009. And he was reading, you want to take a guess?
The Last Superstition? I don't know.
Very close. The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. And that's like how prominent this stuff was when I was in college. So I was like, oh my gosh, I'm just trying to learn math. This guy's over here reading The New Atheist. Christopher Hitchens actually came to do a debate in my school. So there was always kind of a mix of a lot of stuff going on. But you asked me, how does math help? So I wrote down three things, because I think this is three things I've been reflecting on. One is it forced me to find people who knew a discipline better than myself and ask them for help, who are willing to help me. One of my really good friends, who actually went on to do a PhD in mathematics at NC State, turned out they were not only like a really good mathematician, but very patient and kind. And like I could ask them all my dumb questions after a lecture and they would help me. So I found people who knew a discipline more than myself ask them for help. That's the first tool. Second tool is just it forced you to learn some logical reasoning and arguments, deductive, inductive reasoning, proof by induction, which I still find really interesting. I'll just give 3 proofs that I still remember from my undergraduate days that I didn't get at first, but now I'm like, they're pretty beautiful. And one is Euclid's proof for infinitely many primes, and there's different renditions of it. The other one is Russell's paradox, that there can't be a set of all sets. Super interesting. I'm sure you might do a video on that eventually. I've seen your stuff. And the third one is Cantor's diagonalization argument. I'm not sure if you've come across you sound like you've done math and philosophy, so you might have come across that as well. But just learning like the cool intricacies of how those proofs work, that helps you out. And then the third thing I'll add, both of us know this from Dr. Bogardus, is that sometimes thinking and arguments needs to be done slowly. And that's with math, and that's with philosophy. And it can be humbling. You might come to a subject thinking you know it, and then you get beat over the head by Dr. Conjura's discrete mathematics course, and you got to go back to the drawing board. But those are 3 things I learned from working in math.
Yes, okay, that's wonderful. And just for the audience, those are sort of preliminaries that I really wanted to get out of the way, just because it's so interesting to think about the interplay between math and philosophy. I mean, especially when you have someone who has, like Alexander Proust, who has literally 2 PhDs, yes. 2 PhDs, one in math and one in philosophy. And you open up his book, I think it might be behind me. You open up his book on causal finitism, and you're just going through, it's just like, what? But yeah, it's very... Not all parts of it. Some of it is like very accessible, but some of it is just like, wait, you're knee deep in like mathematics. But anyway, there are lots of really interesting overlaps there. And yeah, I'm going to be doing videos on Russell's paradox and other things like that in the future. But the main topic that we're going to be talking about today is just really productive and loving dialogue across ideological barriers. Again, it's sort of piggybacking on that discussion that Josh and I had that was really, really fruitful. And I reached out to John specifically for this because of his emphasis on this in his Classical Theism podcast. And so the first thing really that falls under this broad topic is the topic of intellectual virtues, right? So intellectual virtues really are sort of habits of mind. They're sort of stable character traits that you can really develop and cultivate through practice. And it's all about various beneficial elements of the intellectual life, like intellectual humility, open-mindedness, fair-mindedness, even having a healthy amount of skepticism and so on. So I was wondering, with respect to you, what are some of the most like important intellectual habits or virtues for pursuing truth with others in a like a sort of non-tribalistic and non-polemical manner, right? And so I guess there's a related question, and it's like, how do you try to apply these in your life in particular? Because I really want it to be sort of personalized to you and what you found really helpful in your vast experience on the Classical Theism podcast and so on.
Sure. No, it's a good question. And we're kind of all thrust into this with social media, with blogs, with the constant, content coming at us and interacting, that it's very easy if you don't actually focus on trying to build up intellectual virtue, moral virtue, and so forth. It's just easy just to like kind of react to stuff, and you fall into lots of bad habits. So actually, if I could just say briefly, because I watched the discussion with you and Josh, and then I'll give my own thoughts. I thought it was very good and very fruitful. And what I really like about both of you is that both of you kind of have like the wits and the smarts and the like abilities of studying a lot of stuff and knowing a lot of stuff, that if you wanted not to be virtuous and just like beat people over the head and like make them look stupid, like you and Josh together, both of you are really smart enough to do that, but that's not the goal. So it's really great to have 2 people like that who are after truth and who don't choose to go that route. But okay, 3 things I wrote down. One, and I'm building off the work of a Catholic Christian philosopher that I really admire, Dr. Brian Cross, who writes a lot at a website called calltocommunion.com. But he emphasizes a couple of principles. Maybe I'll just give 2, and then I'll let you come in, and then we can go back and forth a little bit. But first one is the principle of edification, and the second one is the principle of charity. By principle of edification, it's hard, and you got to work towards it and use it in your own way and kind of work on it. But it's basically this: aim to only speak or write what is edifying, and not to speak or write what is not edifying. And a lot of times that might mean that we're not going to make the comment, or we're not going to respond when we're having an emotional reaction to something. We're going to wait a little bit and so forth. Now, when you say that, when you say speak only what is edifying, people mean like, oh, so you're not allowed to criticize everyone. That's not what it means, because proper criticism of ideas, critiquing ideas, and pressing arguments for their consistency and their strength and so forth, that's part of the edification process. But in our comments and in our discussions, it has to be done the right way. And we're never aiming to tear down a person, and we're always aiming to build them up. So even if we're criticizing, it should be the focus. Really, we want to try to keep it on the ideas of getting at truth and helping the other person and speaking what's edifying. And sometimes that means if someone's just being vitriolic on a YouTube comment, if you don't really see much prospect of success, you don't have to respond. You don't have to say something. So that's the first one. Speak what's edifying and don't speak what's not edifying. Do you want to jump back in, or do you want me to give the two others I have?
I'll take them after you lay them out, so you can go on.
Second one I wrote down, principle of charity. And so as a Catholic Christian, I believe in Scripture, and I love what St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13. He talks about love. But he has a weird part where he says, love hopes all things, believes all things, trusts all things. And if you take that the wrong way, you're like, wait a minute, Paul, are you saying I'm supposed to believe everything? That wouldn't make sense. And what Dr. Brian Cross helps us interpret is that believing all things, one way to understand it is that we should believe the best about others. And as far as possible, if we have contrary evidence, that says someone is not acting in good faith, then you don't have to force yourself to believe that they are. But if we have two interpretations on the table of someone's words, we want to try to choose the more charitable one. Actually, that's something I think you emphasize in your book as well, which I found very helpful. And leave it to, in my worldview, leave it to God to judge the heart. We're not out to judge the hearts of others. Believe the best about them whenever possible, and go for the best interpretation. So principle of charity. And then the third one is just love of truth and aiming at truth. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about more with the different habits today, is how do we do that better. But Dr. Cross posted a quote from one of Plato's dialogues, and I can't remember which one it is. But one of the characters asks, I should have looked this up, I'm sorry. But he asks the other guy, he's like, well, before we continue, Gorgias. It's called the Gorgias. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I think it's called the Gorgias. He's like, before I continue, Gorgias, maybe. I don't know who's talking.
Gorgeous.
But he's like,
no,
gorgeous. Okay.
No,
he's like,
I'm just messing with you.
That's okay. That's okay. He says, before we continue, I want to know, what kind of man are you? Are you just trying to learn this stuff, for sophistry reasons, to persuade others and to get the upper hand in, perhaps rhetorical and political spheres of stature? I forget how exactly he phrases it. Or are you a man after truth? And in the context of that dialogue, Dr. Cross was speculating that Plato's actually, and Socrates are actually asking us to ask that question about ourselves. What kind of man are we? Are we going to go after the truth? Or are we just doing it to look smart, to look cool? And that's not what we want to do. And as a Christian, we ought to love the truth, because Christ is the truth. We believe he is the way, truth, and the life. And even if, say we had an argument that could persuade someone, but we know it's not a good argument, it's really bad, I don't think God would want us to use that. So principle of edification, principle of charity, love of truth. Those are kind of the three starting points.
Yeah, no, those are three really good ones. I really like especially the principle of edification, right? I mean, so often when you see on either Facebook posts, or in real life, you'll just see these snide small remarks, and sometimes they can just get under your skin, right? And they're just annoying. It's just it feels like the sole purpose was really to not build up, but precisely to tear down, right? And so I don't know. It's really good to help, orient yourself and remind yourself, am I building up? Always ask yourself, am I building up here? And I fail in this every day, and yeah, so that kind of takes us into, I guess, maybe different tangible ways to apply these principles. But before we're going into certain tangible ways to apply them, I know you spoke of two other ones, and of course I love those. But I'll speak on my own sort of three different tips that I have, at least here, for intellectual virtues and so on, right before we get into tangible ways to implement these things. So turning over to the things that I wrote down for my three, is just one of them is just intellectual empathy, right? So I talked about this in the discussion with Josh, but really it's just understand that the other person is also honestly and just trying to seek the truth, and understand that they can be rational in their disagreement, and that they're speaking from their own perspective, what the position that they occupy on the epistemic landscape, right? Their prior experiences, their intellectual seemings, right? The books that they've read, the debates that they've watched, what seems plausible to them, right? And so really try to enter into their perspective from an intellectual and even emotional standpoint. And so it's that sort of intellectual empathy element. And once you really do that, it'll help curb any of your inclinations to try to tear them down, right? It's precisely because you kind of see yourself in them, right? You see yourself, you see a truth seeker in them, right? And you see like a fellow human in them. And I was actually just talking with Josh today about there's almost like the foundation of rational dialogue, of dialogue even across ideological barriers, is something like mutual understanding. It's something I actually use the phrase mutual indwelling, or perichoresis, which is a Trinitarian term. Like the three divine persons are sort of indwelling within one another. Their lives are sort of intimately bound up with and tied in with one another. It's a sort of mutual indwelling and mutual perichoresis. And we have to do that with one another, like across ideological barriers. If it's a non-classical theist and a classical theist, or if it's an atheist and a theist, like we should try to strive for this kind of perichoresis, a kind of mutual indwelling, seeing yourself in the other, and really trying to understand that they themselves are seekers of truth as well. And just entering into their perspective, and really affirming that, and so on. So that's one of them. It's a sort of intellectual empathy and perichoresis. The second one is just fair-mindedness, which is distinct from open-mindedness. But fair-mindedness is, well, the definition is evading me. I probably should have put it on my thing. I think I discussed it in my book, but it's really giving each intellectual stance its due, right? So it's sort of like justice as applied to different positions, right? So you're not just going to ignore an entire aspect of the literature because you don't like it, or because you've already written it off as wrong or incorrect or what have you, right? And so it's really giving each element of a debate its due. It's being fair-minded in that regard, not privileging one perspective from the get-go, but sort of investigating it from multiple different perspectives. And then the final one is, of course, just listen, right? I put an exclamation mark behind that, like listen, right? I mean, truly try to understand. Don't have a sort of script that you're trying to run through in your mind. Oh, if he says this, I'm gonna respond with this. If he says that, like that's sort of just treating as a sort of robotic kind of conversation, right? Really try to listen, and mutually indwell with the other. So I'm wondering before we turn to like different tangible actions to implement these things, I'm wondering what you think about some of the things that I just laid out.
No, I think there's some good ideas there. I especially like online. It's like you talked about the quick snide remarks that people often make, and it honestly can just become a cesspool sometimes. But you do so much of the opposite of that. When sometimes, like when you emphasis like that, you find someone's beliefs, their contributions valuable, and you might even put like different emojis to indicate this. I think some people are so not used to that they might even think that you're being disingenuous because they're just so not used to that. But I know that you actually are trying to live out these virtues, which is really, really awesome. So I think it could be disarming to people that they're expecting to just be yelled at, and they're not yelled at. And you just say, you know what, that was a valuable comment. Have you ever thought about this? Just the manner of phrasing can really help push the discussion forward. I think you have some good ideas. I think that was cool. I didn't think about that. Perichoresis. I like the application to that idea of thinking with people. And going off of that with the principle of edification, if people think you're not listening to them and that you're not giving them a fair hearing and that you're dismissing their arguments too quickly, they're actually going to be closed to, perhaps being edified in the way that you think you could do. So like perhaps you think you have, a strong argument for a position that you think they should hold and that would benefit them and that would help them in their life. But if you come off as dismissive and not listening and not even considering the strongest arguments on their side, then it's going to be tougher for that edification to actually happen. So I think you bring up some good thoughts there. I like the rational disagreement stuff. We're going to talk about that more. I definitely think it's possible. And I think a key thing is to focus. People get too caught up with trying to diagnose, and you kind of brought this up with psychologizing, but trying to diagnose people instead of diagnosing ideas. Mm-hmm. And I think as philosophers, we really have to try hard to separate those and to talk about the ideas versus the people. And we might think an idea, I think we're allowed to think that an idea is a bad idea and that we think it's incorrect. And you do a nice job in your book of taking down scientism pretty, ferociously, if I could use that word. I shouldn't use that word. It's too charged. But, you criticize the idea, But that doesn't mean any person who maybe leans in that direction or something like that is irrational or should be criticized in the same vein, and so forth. So I think we got to distinguish people and ideas, and we'll talk more about that. But those are just a couple things to add on to what you said.
No, yeah, I really like those. Those are excellent contributions. So the last thing before we move on to strategies for productive dialogue is really just thinking about that fair-mindedness and how it relates to the confirmation bias, right? So confirmation bias, as most people are aware, is sort of just our inherent tendency toward kind of confirming our pre-existing beliefs or what we want to be true, and sort of ignoring or discounting opposing evidence, or even opposing sources that might potentially have opposing evidence. So I'm wondering, like, what are some of the best ways that you've found to like fight against our sort of these inherent tendencies that we have, and towards confirmation bias? Like, what are some of the best ways? And this might actually bridge nicely into strategies for productive dialogue. But I guess I really want to touch on, just before that, ridding confirmation bias. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I've actually heard Trent Horn talk about this, and he says that, well, everyone on all sides of different debates have to deal with this. Have to deal with this idea of a habit towards motivated reasoning or confirmation bias. I don't know, we might disagree a little bit on this too, because I don't always think it's bad to want something to be true or to want to confirm beliefs that you hold. I mean, consider the belief that pursuit of truth is valuable and worth our effort. Pursuit of truth is valuable and worth our effort. I'd say most philosophers want that to be true, right? That's why they're doing this philosophy. So they don't necessarily need to constantly fight against that. So I wouldn't say you always need to fight against what you want to be true, but I like your phrase of inherent dispositions, or you said tendencies. That's what I think we're talking about here. I think motivated reasoning and confirmation bias are problematic when they give rise to bad habits. And what I mean by that is, you might, because of this motivated reasoning, you refuse to canvass all the best available data. You only look at things that will help your case. And that's not a healthy habit. That's not going to be consistent with pursuing truth for its own sake. But I'd also point out this. That's actually consistent. And this is another point from Dr. Brian Cross. It's actually consistent with any level of knowledge, or I think it's consistent with any level of knowledge to develop a good habit or bad habit of motivated reasoning. Here's what I mean. Someone could be really confident in a truth. They could be really sure about it, maybe even certain, let's say, but they still have to make a choice. Are they going to canvass all the data and consider all the arguments fairly, or are they only going to choose a narrow scope and the ones that help their position? Conversely, someone could have, not a strong feeling about a position, but like maybe they're a 50-50, or maybe they have, no leanings whatsoever, but they still could choose whether they're going to canvass all the data or whether they're only going to go for something that helps their case. So it's that habit of choosing to, look at multiple lines of information. I like, here's another tip for how to do this. Be willing, and you do this well, but be willing to critique arguments or evidence that show up within your own camp, so to speak. That can be helpful. Someone who's really good at this is Matt Fradd. So Matt Fradd hosts Pints with Aquinas, and he does a nice job of pushing back on the guests. I think, honestly, he does a better job than me. I want to kind of learn and develop that more, but he will really criticize their position and like kind of force them to justify it and say, even though he's a Catholic and he's kind of committed on that, he's not going to say, just let them get away with an argument that doesn't seem very good. He's going to push back on that. So I'll give an example in Catholicism. And if I'm talking too long, then I'll just stop after this and you can go. Do I have time for one example?
Yeah, no, it's all cool.
Okay. So it's pretty common sometimes in Catholic circles to say that the idea of sola scriptura is self-defeating. And sola scriptura may or may not be self-defeating depending on how it's defined. And different non-Catholic Christians have different ways of defining that doctrine. But sometimes what Catholics will do is they'll just kind of take their own definition, place it on the person, and then say, ha, that one's self-defeating. But if you look at the more mature arguments and some of the more nuances that some Protestants have put forward, it turns out that their definitions may not be self-defeating. Now, that doesn't mean that they're true or even that there's good arguments for them or that it's right. I'm just saying that as a Catholic, if we want to be more honest and fight against our confirmation bias, we should be willing to call that out. So call out arguments within our own camp, even when they're not great. So those are just a few preliminary ideas on that.
No, I really like that too. And yeah, I mean, it's also frustrating when sometimes when you see someone like critiquing scientism, for instance, and then they go on to say like, therefore physicalism or therefore naturalism or therefore atheism is false as a result of that, just because there happens to be, you know, a coincidence or coincidence, I guess more properly, between acceptance of scientism and rejection of theism, and that's something that just really bothers me. It's just like, no, you should reject scientism, and like you can at least in principle adopt these other positions. So that's also something I definitely share. I want to just emphasize that I share some of that frustration, and I know Josh and I talked about how frustration sometimes can even be a motivator in debates like this, and it should be like a properly oriented frustration, right? A frustration that arises when you see these intellectual virtues being abused, when you see these intellectual vices, right? It's frustration. Emotions are directed towards certain objects, and really, I think when the frustration is properly directed, it can be a great motivator, a great tool, really, for your toolkit in pursuing truth, actually, which is kind of interesting, and it might sound somewhat paradoxical.
But can I add one more example
Yeah,
I just
yeah.
thought of too? Because it could be, not only is it good to fight against the things that we're talking about and the bad habits, but it can actually be, it could be disarming to the audience. It could be edifying to them if you, even though you might disagree with a position that they hold, but you either make their argument stronger or show an argument against their position doesn't work. And I wanted to give an example where you've done this a few times with the modal collapse argument. And we might talk about that more later. But a lot of people just post a version that Tomaszewski's paper deals with and say, you know, this is just irrefutable, modal collapse goes through. And I've seen you in the comments saying, well, actually, no, it's actually invalid because this reason, and giving a nice parity argument and explaining his answer, even though you yourself might be pursuing some other modal collapse arguments that you think are stronger and that also work. But the fact that you're willing to do that, I think, really fights against confirmation bias, and it can allow your ideas to land better later on. So I just wanted to add that example.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So now let's go on to certain strategies for productive dialogue. So we've been really talking about the importance of this, and we've already dealt with certain tips, some really good tips, different principles that you can use, and so on. But I'm trying to look for certain concrete, tangible strategies, really, for engaging in discussion, whether it be on Facebook or in real life with those with whom we disagree. And so there are actually two aspects of it. I'll ask the first question for the first aspect. It's just like, what are some of these concrete, tangible strategies? And then the second one is some methods for de-escalation. But we won't get to de-escalation right now. I just want to focus maybe for like 5 minutes on what are some of like concrete, really tangible things that we can try to implement. I know we've sort of been touching on some thus far, but maybe you've some more to discuss here. So I'll turn it over to you for that first question.
Maybe we should escalate first, and then we have to de-escalate ourselves. So be funny. No, just a couple things, and some of these are going to repeat what I've already said, but then I'll try to add and make it more concrete. So the principles of charity and edification, if those are in your back of your mind, then the manner in which you form your comments and your critiques and your arguments is going to be better. It's going to have a better chance to land. But how about some new stuff? Again, there's another one repeating, and then I'll get to a new one. Focus on ideas and not people as much as possible. And it's very hard because people will come across and criticize a person. They might criticize you. If you're in YouTube comments, especially, they can be really, really, let's just say, not moderated well. And people are going to, they're going to do a lot of personal insults and stuff. But as much as possible, kind of just peel away all those layers and try to get down to the content and give a content-based reply. I think it's always possible to give a content-based reply. Actually, I'm reading a paper right now, which I don't understand because I haven't studied epistemology and I just don't get it yet. But it's by Dr. Tomas Bogardus and another author, and it's on the nature of knowledge. And I think you'll actually really enjoy it. Have you seen this paper or heard of it?
Is it knowledge is believing something because it's true?
Yes, that's it. And I haven't even gotten through it yet. I'm just like trying to understand what the heck it's about. But anyway, as part of it, he talks about how figuring out what the crucial elements of something, it's going to involve like peeling away and like stripping away all the non-necessary information and then getting to it. I think that's something we can do with online comments or even with person-to-person dialogue. If someone says something that's surrounded by a lot of personal attacks, and I guess this is kind of de-escalation too, but it's always possible just to not respond to any of those and only respond to the content. And if there's not much content there, then your reply can be much shorter. But to sum it up, I would say try to do your best to focus on the ideas and not the people. And if you're thinking about the person, you're really bothered by it, say a prayer for them or think about them positively and try to love them. Maybe transition to a personal message if you want to. Third thing is, and I'll let you come back and forth on this, start by asking questions if possible. And I like to do this a lot, especially when I'm in an environment where I really am not well equipped to know the arguments or understand the positions, like with epistemology stuff. I haven't really studied a lot of that. Different objections to skeptical theism and stuff. I haven't studied a lot of that. But so I would kind of start by asking questions about someone else's position before I just assume they're wrong and assume that I know it. Let them articulate it and clarify, oh, what do you mean by this? Oh, can you explain what's your justification for this premise? And that can help a conversation move forward better. And then the last thing I'll just add is minimize your desire to look cool for people watching, and just try to get to some truth, try to gain some nuggets. When I was learning math, I learned this very quickly. You're not going to get it all at once. Some of it is going to take a long time. Some of it might take years, but try to pick up little nuggets in those conversations. But yeah, focus on ideas, ask questions, minimize looking cool. And don't be afraid. Let the other person have the last word. That's another way to not look cool, stuff like that. So that's where I would start.
Yeah, no, hashtag salvage the nuggets. Yes, I'm loving it. Okay, so one thing that I wanted to add there before we move into methods for de-escalation, and again, we're just only going to spend probably 3 minutes on that because I do want to have some time for the last one specifically applied to classical theism. But the before we move on to strategies for de-escalation, I did want to say, if you're engaging with someone in real life or in Facebook, I do think it might be nice, instead of immediately going into the content, really trying to signal at the beginning that you're listening to them, or that you appreciate their contribution, or that you genuinely find what they're saying valuable, or there are genuine things in there that are making you think, right? It helps them really see that you are sort of integrating this and thinking about it and reflecting on what they say. It makes them feel important and empowered, and that's really good, right? And not only that, and we're not just doing this for just sort of strategies, right? This isn't a sort of strategic, aha, I'm just going to say that I appreciate him. No, genuinely try to at least get yourself to signal that you're listening. Truly try to appreciate them and signal that at the beginning in some form or other. It can definitely help mitigate certain biases and tribalistic tendencies that might be, that might otherwise come out. So that's the first one. Well, I guess that's the only one that I wanted to add. But now I think we can spend just a little bit of time, because I do want to get to this last one. What are some methods for de-escalation that you have sort of thought up? And for people who don't know what I'm talking about, de-escalation, or I guess escalation, right? That's really when a conversation has derailed a bit with snide remarks or colorful adjectives or insults. When I say colorful, I usually mean Joe kind of colorful. So instead of saying incorrect, you say blatantly incorrect, or instead of saying wrong, you say patently wrong or obviously wrong, things like that. So that's the kind of color that I'm talking about. And then what can we sort of do to cool the sort of simmering heat of the conversation down? That's de-escalation. So I'll turn it over to you. What are some of these methods for de-escalation?
Sure, and I'll try to be brief so we can get to the next thing. But I'll just say, if those are all the escalation you have in mind, those are pretty mild and tame to some of the groups that I've been in when I've tried to ask certain questions and things. I've just been, you get hammered with stuff, and people can get very angry. So, okay, first thing, if you believe in God or you're searching for that, me as a Catholic Christian, I find daily prayer helpful. But other people find different things. Just in the morning, you set aside some time to commit yourself to the Lord. And when you go into those dialogues, you got to remember that, Jesus is not going to want you acting like an idiot and acting like a jerk. So that's helpful for me. Second thing, sometimes you got to choose silence. You don't have to respond to everyone in every environment. If it's very hostile, you can walk away. Or if you're going to respond, you can refuse to respond in kind. You can let the person know if you really want to. You could say, hey, I don't think you're fully appreciating what I have to offer here. So I think the conversation's run its course, but maybe we can revisit it in the future. And kind of like a mild shaming almost, but just identifying, I don't think you're really treating me well. Yes. And so I don't have to have that conversation. Emphasize the value someone brings to a conversation. You've done that. You just pointed that out. Say that they're contributing, they're bringing value, and emphasize that. That can help de-escalate. And then it's always possible. One of my favorite things to do, I guess I've kind of said this already, but sometimes I'll just morph from discussion mode, argument mode, debate mode, and so forth, into information gathering mode. And I'm like, okay, I'm kind of done, debating this person or discussing back and forth or even dialoguing. But at the very least, I'm going to try to ask questions, gather information about what they're saying, salvage those nuggets down. And that way, at least I have the information. So if it comes up again in the future, I'll be like, okay, maybe this helped me learn some new arguments or some new points, but it's not worth getting into in flying off the handle and all that good stuff. I've never felt better afterwards. Whenever I get into a fight with anyone, whether it's a friend, whether it's my wife, whether it's someone on the internet, you don't feel good afterwards. You always feel worse. So we want to kind of refuse to enter those hostile conversations where possible.
Yeah, no, I do think those are really good. That's really, I like how you said that, because that's where Josh and I ultimately ended up as well. It's just like, okay, well, really, once you've gotten to that point where there's a need for de-escalation, you've kind of already gotten it wrong, right? You sort of need to nip it in the bud, as it were, from the get-go by implementing the other techniques we've been talking about, so it doesn't get there. But yeah, I do think that's probably the best way to answer that one. So the last thing that we're going to discuss is basically specifically applying this to the classical theism debate. Whether it's in like the literature or whether it's online, whether it's in Facebook comments or YouTube discussions or even in real life. So like, what are some things that both quote unquote sides can do better to facilitate like productive, non-tribalistic flow of ideas? And so like, what have you found at least works in your personal experience? So I'm wondering if you can help us with that with respect to both sides, right? So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I wrote a bunch of things, a couple things down that I want to mention. By the way, I have some extra time, so I'm not like in a super rush. I definitely have a few extra minutes, so don't worry. But in general, return to the arguments and the ideas instead of the people or the personalities involved. And I know I've mentioned that many times, but there's a lot of personalities on all sides of theistic discussions. There's new atheists, there's reformed presuppositionalists, there's all kinds of folks who have different personalities. And whenever possible, let's try to return to the arguments. Second thing is view criticism a little differently. Try not to view it as an immediate threat that needs to be vanquished, but as a chance to further develop one's position. And I think we can do this. Believe it or not, this actually kind of hit home more with me when I was listening to Oppie's discussion with William Lane Craig on the argument from mathematics. And at one point in the discussion, Oppie just said, I've been working on a theory for 10, 15 years or so forth. And at any point, you might be able to raise an argument that looks a little weird for that theory, just considered in isolation. But when integrated into the whole, it may have, other virtues that make it more plausible. And I would suggest that in the classical theism debate, we can kind of do this as well. So you've raised some really good points as far as on our discussions of the Trinity, the aloneness argument, and so forth, contingent knowledge, and that. I think as classical theists, we need to look at these arguments and not see them as like threats that need to be squashed, but items that need to be answered or integrated, or perhaps even our position needs to be modified in certain ways to accommodate what's being said. Now, that doesn't. My point is, because I don't want this to be taken the wrong way, it doesn't mean I'm admitting that classical theism's false because there's this argument. You don't have to go there. Our beliefs and our worldviews could be more sticky in that regard. Instead, we can look at them and see what they do. I think Oppie said this as well, that arguments are really mainly to show an inconsistency within a position. Is that right? Can you tell me, what exactly did he say on the nature of arguments? Because he brought that up with your discussion and with Phaser, and I think I have it right. But what exactly does he say about the nature of arguments?
Yeah, well, a full analysis would take hours. But to those of you who are interested, we did a nice discussion. It was one of my earlier discussions on my channel. It's probably hour 45 or something like that, maybe 2 hours. But yeah, he arguments for him are just sort of just lists of sentences, and they're really their best purpose is, as you said, just sort of illustrate that you cannot accept all the premises, but yet reject the conclusion. That's really all they tell you. It doesn't tell you which premise to reject. It doesn't tell you that you rationally ought to accept each one of these premises, and so on. And yeah, so you did hit the nail on the head for the most part there. So I
think that's a helpful way to look at it too, because so the argument reveals an inconsistency. but it doesn't tell you where to go from there.
Hmm.
So as a classical theist, as a naturalist, when you get hit with an argument, you don't need to like get all emotional about it and like start punching the other person or something like that. That's ridiculous. No, but instead you could say, oh, wait a minute. Are the terms clear? Are the premises true? Is the reasoning valid here? Do we need to reject one of these claims? Do we need to disambiguate one of these terms?
Hmm.
Do we need to nuance the argument? And perhaps do we need to revise a particular tenet of our position? And I think if we look at arguments more that way, instead of like an all or nothing, this person is using it as a club to convert me on the spot or not, then our discussions can be much more fruitful and both sides can kind of help make both of their worldviews more plausible. I haven't read it, but the way I've heard people talk about the book with Dr. Rasmussen and Dr. Felipe Leon is that they kind of build on each other's
Hmm.
ideas and adjust things here or there to aim more towards truth. So I think we can do this in the classical theist debate, and we can do it by not seeing arguments as threats or like you better
Weapons.
abandon your
Yeah.
position or else you're irrational, and
Hmm.
rather seeing them as invitations to clarify or even improve our own position. So that's a start.
Yeah, definitely. Arguments as sort of tools rather than weapons, really. Um, really, arguments put forward an argument to serve someone, really, not to show irrationality or something like that. So, I definitely like that. So another thing that I really wrote down for this for myself is just like the language that we use. Um, so, yeah, I mean, like, I don't think it really helps anything for either side to describe arguments that they've come up with as sort of a, like rational demonstrations or like sort of akin to geometric proofs or something along those lines. I do from my own experience, it seems like that introduces a sort of needless, I guess, tribalism. And it's like, no, someone, it sounds like you're saying, not you, but it sounds like whoever describes one such argument on either side as a sort of rational demonstration or akin to a Euclidean proof, right? That really gets the other side. It gets its guard up. They shift from arguments as tool mindset to this is something that's trying to knock me down. It's trying to be knocked down. All I need to do is just show that there's at least some rational way to deny one of these premises. And I do think that both sides really should stray away from conceiving of arguments as these sort of and really stray away even from the language of rational proof or demonstration, but rather as sort of arguments, as tools, as things like that. So really modifying our language, or like decisive proofs or knockdown argument or things like that. And both sides should really focus on our language and be, I guess, much more nuanced when we're making claims about our arguments, these sort of meta level claims about the success and the strength of the arguments in question. So that's one thing. If you want to comment on
Can we talk about that for a little bit? Because I
that.
think I wonder if we'll end up just agreeing, but I think we'll have some disagreement, but some of it might be verbal. I understand that when someone says this is a rational demonstration, that can make it seem like it's meant to affect that its force is on people such that if they don't accept it, they're being irrational. And I would want to say that that consequence of it is not really an entailment of using the word rational demonstration. But if it happens over and over again like that, and that's just how people take it, okay, maybe we have to consider how we use the language. But I think people who use the words rational demonstration mean specific things by it that don't entail that a person who rejects their so-called rational demonstration is irrational. Um, Let me see. It's tough. Let's think with mathematics. I mean, it's okay if we might disagree on this, but say Cantor's diagonalization argument that the rational numbers don't have, this is me thinking and trying to remember, but they don't have the same cardinality as the real numbers. Are you familiar with this idea?
Yeah. That it's like um, or you could either use the natural numbers or the rational numbers, right? The
Or
the
right,
cardinality of the reals is strictly greater than. It's like a left one as opposed
exactly.
to a left zero.
Right. And so Cantor devised a proof of this, or what he would call a rational demonstration. Okay. I think it works. I think I see it. I think it's a rational demonstration. I know at least one philosopher, actually, he's a libertarian philosopher, Steve Patterson. He's got a cool little podcast, and he disputes this. and he says Cantor's argument doesn't work. And I think he's wrong. And I think that's a rational demonstration. But I don't think me saying that makes him irrational. In that way, I would try to salvage my usage of the words. Perhaps you just think we should just jettison the usage of those words because they could be have certain connotations. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think what you said originally was absolutely correct. This is just a sort of terminological dispute, but that really does go down to how we try to modify our language really to just accommodate different elements of the debate and how different people, see these things, right? So I'm just speaking in terms of my experience with people online. Like when they hear that, their guard goes up, right?
Right.
So, and I would argue that, we already have proper terms like argument. We already have like terms to serve the function that someone might want for the rational demonstration. I mean, if we just mean that it's, a deductive argument, well, we already have a word for that. That's not sort of, as it were, loaded. I mean, we can just use the word argument or something like that.
That's a good point about deductive argument. Because I was going to say, if you just say arguments, especially when it talked about like classical theism and arguments for God's existence, some of them are inductive, some of them are abductive,
Bayesian.
Bayesian. You know all these terms better than I do. But say someone wants to indicate that their argument is different in a different way. It's based on metaphysical principles that they believe, based on their metaphysics and their epistemology, that we have access to with a high degree of confidence that the scholastics would call certainty, but there's debates on what certainty means and all that stuff. If someone says that we have an argument that's based on this and it follows from the premises, and that's what I mean by a rational demonstration, but that doesn't mean that it's not a debate ender, it's not a dialogue ender, it's not a showstopper. As always, I think we can see it as, okay, I put forth my demonstration, quote unquote, let's discuss it. What do you think about it? And if somebody rejects part of that, then they need to be spoken to. If we want to talk about the specific quote you probably have in mind with this stuff, because I think we've gone back and forth a while, let me just leave it at that. Let me leave it at that. I don't know if you wanted to talk about a specific instance of this that's particularly bothered you, but I think it's mostly verbal, and we could probably come to a reasonable understanding of it.
Yeah, and definitely like I did want to caution, just like when we say like when you said we can have a high degree of confidence, like I would warn against using that sort of we language. Like I do think that
maybe I should.
No, I'm not trying to like police you or anything. I'm just saying like sight and confidence, they're always person-based, right? So it depends really on your position on the epistemological landscape. And so I think I'm with Josh that there isn't this sort of overarching we, which is such that there is this confidence that is, that's like proper, right? Because your confidence really, it should depend on your priors and your experiences and your intellectual seemings, the books that you've read, the debates that you've watched, and so on. So I do think that there's a very individuality. I don't want to say individualistic, but there's a very person-based and individual specific, I guess, context-based element to justification and confidence and so on. And that's really what drives a lot of people's frustration at the use of things like like rational demonstration when we do seem to have different terms that are already in use, like argument and so on. And I guess I don't want to like word police, right? Like obviously I don't want to be a thought police or word police. Like people, you can use whatever words you want and you can use whatever language you want. Like I'm not I'm not going to stop you. I'm a huge, it's so huge. I am a huge like free speech proponent. So almost like a free speech fundamentalist. So anyway, that's going way too far into the details, but that's just one thing that
I think that's good. I think there's, so I guess for my part, I would just say there's a way to use the phrase rational demonstration that doesn't entail those negative things. It just means a technical term by the nature of the argument. And someone might hear that and say, oh, well, it's not, I don't see it as a rational demonstration because I disagree with these premises and I have low confidence in this inference and so forth. So for me, I don't see it as problematic necessarily that people use the term, but if they use it as like a hammer, then yeah, that's not really helpful.
Yeah, no, I think we're mostly in agreement here. It's mostly a sort of terminological thing. So I definitely agree that there's a technical sense of it, which is perfectly fine. It just means a deductive argument, which is
Right.
based on metaphysics, essentially. It's just a
Right.
deductive argument that's based on metaphysics. So I'm fine with that. But I'm very keen to how these affect our sort of dialectical contexts with other people with whom we might disagree. And so I do think we should at least try to keep in mind what language that we use and how that's going to influence our dialectical context and the partners in which we engage. And so even if it has this sort of more technical sense, from at least from my experience, like I would personally refrain from using it just because I've seen how it makes people get their guards up, right? And so I wouldn't really want to call my aloneness argument a metaphysical or rational demonstration or proof of the falsity of classical theism. Like I wouldn't want to do that because I can see how that puts people's guards up and so on.
That's
Even
a great
though,
example, though, because I actually think your aloneness argument is, in its setup, like it fits the category of what classical theists mean by rational demonstration. But I could totally get it. Like you don't want to call it that because you don't want it to come across in that manner. But it's something that, classical, just you claiming it was a rational demonstration wouldn't mean that it automatically decisively showed that classical
absolutely.
theism is false, but just people need to grapple with it. But I get that. Different terminology, yeah. And
Yeah.
you're in more of these discussions with different philosophers even more often than I am. On the podcast, it's mostly, friendly fire, and I'm interviewing someone who's already kind of in the Catholicism side. So I throw objections at them, but it's not going to come across as, I'm trying to threaten them because I'm already like quote unquote in that same camp. But you might be in more of those discussions where you're more sensitive to the language and you get what gets people fired up. And we don't want to get people fired up. We want them to get to the truth and to love the truth.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. And I guess my tip would just be maybe here's our synthesis. Pay attention to the context in which you're in and base your language on that context, right? So if you're going to be chatting with I don't know, with someone like you might vehemently disagree with something, maybe you might want to refrain from using something like rational or rational demonstration or proof or something like that. Maybe you can say this is an argument that we can consider, and I hope it serves you. It's a tool, things like that. But if you're in another context where there's that mutual understanding that this has a more I guess a more technical sense of a deductive argument based on metaphysics, then it'll be perfectly fine. So I think that's our synthesis.
I think
Would you agree?
that's a good synthesis. And I will say, it's a good point to revisit. Even among debates among Thomists, among themselves, can sometimes be some of the most, invective and like angry and stuff like that. So and maybe they would do better if they didn't necessarily sometimes use some of that. Like, well, no, this view is decisively incorrect. If you hold it, you're irrational. Like, that's not what we're saying. We're saying we think we have a good argument for a position. Do you want to consider this? I think you should consider it for these reasons. Let's talk about it and go from there. But no, I think that's a good synthesis.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. Well, I'll turn over to you for some final remarks on the overall discussion, but I do want to thank you so much for coming on and engaging with this discussion with me. We've gone over so many wonderful tips and so many wonderful strategies for de-escalation, for for the principle of charity, principle of edification, love of truth, things like this. We've gone over concrete strategies for mitigating confirmation bias, for developing intellectual virtues, strategies for productive dialogue, and then we specifically applied it to the classical theism debate, or the context of classical theism. So I really enjoyed the discussion. Do you have any sort of final thoughts, maybe overall?
Sure. Yeah, Joe, I'll just thank you for bringing me on. This was really enlightening for me to hear more from you. I find you to be an extremely talented philosopher that I look forward to reading your work, to seeing your work for years to come. And I would encourage people to watch the discussion you had with Dr. Josh Rasmussen, to watch this. And I'm just kind of drawn to, as a final thought, your intellectual empathy thing that you brought up earlier. It's hard to do that because there's a lot of different positions people have, but we got to strive for it. And we got to recognize, let me just put it in this context. You could have someone who is really convicted about, Calvinistic Christianity being true, and they're making their argument. You could have someone who's really convicted about Islam. You could have someone who's really convicted about naturalism. And there's all these different worldviews. And it is really hard to kind of step into that other person's shoes. And the final point I just wanted to make is that having intellectual and striving for intellectual virtues doesn't mean that you have to say that your worldview is incorrect, or that
Mm-hmm.
you don't have a high confidence in something, or and this is something that Josh has brought up, where there's a lot of pressure in academia to be more modest, to never act sure of anything. And I would say you can aim for intellectual virtue and you could strive for it, whether you're highly confident in your views or whether you're somewhere in the middle or whether you're lower. This is something that we can all strive for. So striving for intellectual virtue doesn't mean that I'm not really that sure if Catholicism is true.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, I have a really high confidence with, my relationship with Christ that it's true, but I still have to show those virtues and, be willing to consider arguments to the contrary when they pop up. So I'd leave it there. And I think you're doing an incredible job. And I encourage people to watch your channel, read your book, and go from there.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, everyone definitely check out the Classical Theism podcast. He's got wonderful guests on there. He got wonderful philosophers and things like that. So, John DeRosa, thank you so much for coming on and joining me for this enlightening discussion. I'm Joe Schmid, and this is The Majesty of Reason. As always, peace out.